Washington Journal continues.
Larry Pratt with the Gun Owners of America. The Senate is going to be voting on some gun legislation Monday. What do you think?
Well, it's a failure of the Republican leadership, really, that they even have to bring something like this up. But I don't think it's going to help the Democrats. And I'm still puzzled. I still haven't figured out why the Democrats continue to push gun legislation when every time they've done it in the past, it redounds to their electoral troubles. Starting in the 90s, Bill Clinton, who's a pretty accomplished politician, observed that pushing the gun control measures that he did was his bad, and it cost his party control of the Congress. And that's been a similar result in other occasions when Democrats have pursued an anti-Second Amendment agenda. Al Gore being notable, having won a primary based on how anti-Second Amendment he was, and the general election came along, and even against a kind of a lukewarm candidate, he was able to lose. So I'm still puzzled. Maybe the Democrats are continuing to, sort of like that little boy with the manure pile, and he's told that there's a diamond at the bottom of it, and they keep digging through. But in the meantime, they're getting kind of dirty.
What's the downside to people who are on terrorist lists not being able to buy guns? Why not?
If there had been a court procedure saying that somebody on a list had even had charges brought against him in a regular court, not some special national security court, but a regular court of the land, where he had an opportunity or she had an opportunity to have representation from a lawyer, then I would say maybe we can talk about that. But just to have a list that has people's names on it, and we don't know how the names get there. And what do you say about a list that says Ted Kennedy's on the no-fly list? Now, arguably, he should have been on a no-drive list, but to put him on a no-fly list is just preposterous. Representative McClintock recently was on this list. That tells you there's something very wrong with this list, and the fact that none of us know how that happened. I'm not sure even Kennedy knew how his name got on the list.
Are there any restrictions? Is there any middle ground that you would support when it comes to guns? And
we've had a lot of experience in this country with gun control legislation. It's not been a very satisfactory experience. And where you have the most intense efforts at control, places like Chicago, you hear these dreadful weekend reports of murder committed in those places. You don't have a problem like that coming out of Vermont or Wyoming or Arkansas or Alaska or Arizona, places where people can carry a gun without even a permit. They don't ask anybody's permission. Put it in their purse, put it in their pocket, and they're good to go. So it seems that we're having trouble digesting the fact that the government not only should not be regulating this, but it's done a very poor job.
Larry Pratt is our guest. Gun Owners of America is his organization. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen, divided by political affiliation. Fourth line set aside for gun owners. We want to hear from you as well. 202-748-8003 is the number for you to call. How many people in America own guns?
Well, happily, nobody really knows, but I would guesstimate maybe half of the country, at least, has access to a gun in the house.
What about expanded background checks for the sale at gun shows or anything like that?
Well, in the last year of record, at least that I know of, there were some 18 million background checks done. There were 14 prosecutions that resulted from that. Not exactly what you would call a stellar performance of a crime-fighting tool. So it's been a crime-fighting failure, but more than that, it's being conducted by a government that can't be believed. The government was not supposed to be listening in on our phone calls, and yet the metadata was collected by the NSA against the law, and nobody was punished. the government was not supposed to be giving guns to the Mexican cartels, and yet they did, and nobody's been punished. And people actually died from that, a lot more even than in Chicago on a weekend. So the government has a very poor record, and to entrust something as critical as who can own a gun, which is a constitutionally protected right in very absolute language, shall not be infringed, we just don't see any argument that's going to pertain that we should yield any ground there, because the government doesn't even deserve having an argument.
CBS News poll, 57% of Americans support a ban on assault weapons. What's your reaction to that, and how do you define an assault weapon?
Well, we don't, in our form of government, do government by polling. We do it by elections, and then you have a chance in that election district or state to have it out and have a debate. And that's what produces the Congress that we have. Obviously an imperfect process, but it's certainly a far cry from government by polling. Polling is not even a science. Polling is a guesstimate at best. It's are these people representative in the poll of actually those who might go to vote? Frequently, they are not. Polls are frequently wrong. Sometimes they're right. It's kind of like flipping a coin. Sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're not. Not a good basis for making law. And I'm sorry, the rest of your question was?
What's your definition of an assault weapon?
An assault weapon is something that was invented in the media. If we are talking about a real assault weapon, it's something the military issues to soldiers, and it's capable of firing full automatic. It has a switch on it generally that enables the person with the gun to opt between semi-automatic and fully automatic fire. There are a few of those in private possession, but very few. Most of the firearms owned in this country that are called assault weapons are actually semi-automatic, and they are the same as the hunting weapons that lots of people have. They may look different, they may have had a black coat of paint, but the internal functioning of the gun is the same. So it's been a very interesting debate using words that have been brought forth by the likes of the Senator Kennedys of the world that are interested in banning guns, and it doesn't have a real basis in what goes on. We're often talking about something in a debate conducted by people who really don't know what they're talking about.
Can you defend Omar Mateen's ownership of the AR-15 that he took into the Pulse nightclub?
I can defend Mateen's being able to buy the gun because there was no criminal record that was available on him. But what I could never defend, and what I want to attack relentlessly and unceasingly, is the fact that he was able to find a place where nobody had a gun. So he went into a gun-free environment that was imposed by law. And the people that died there partly died at the hands of the legislators who put that law on the books. Obviously, they didn't pull the trigger, but they facilitated what he was able to do. And that's something that we feel very intensely at Gun Owners of America should be taken off our books. That's really the task in front of us at the moment in the Congress, is to get rid of gun-free zones.
John in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, on a Republican line. You're on with Larry Pratt of the Gun Owners of America.
What an honor. Mr. Pratt, you're a great American. And
thank you.
Start with that. I think there's a bigger picture going on within our government, though. It's not just our guns that they want. There's EPA laws that any little puddle on your land is now formative of a wetlands. And what they want to do is they want to take our land. Now, they cannot take our land until they take our guns. And if they come after everybody's property at the same time, you're looking at a violent revolution. So I think what the government is really after is to disarm the population so that they can then use bogus laws that they've written into code, into the EPA code, and come onto your property, take your cattle and take your land. Basically, the cattle are degradation to the property, which they're going to claim as a wetlands, and they're going to make their bogus legal arguments to take our property. The
All right,
guns
John,
are just the first step.
I think we got your point. Larry Pratt.
No, it's a concern that's particularly acute among people in the West, and the caller from the West, I think, represents well the concern that many have. You've got not only the EPA, but you've got the BLM and many other federal agencies that are telling people how they're supposed to be making a living using federal regulation to make making a living increasingly difficult. And then you add on top of that gun control, and it becomes a very oppressive burden of federal regulation. And when you get people enforcing that don't behave well and act as petty tyrants, it makes the situation near intolerable. That's really, I think, what was behind a lot of the difficulty that bubbled up at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada, where there had been a long-term effort by the government to force people on those lands to sell to the federal government. Part of the argument was that this was in an effort to save a tortoise. Well, it turns out the tortoise is flourishing. It's hardly endangered. What's endangered are people working on the land in the West because of the federal government.
Next call for Larry Pratt comes from Robert right here in Washington, D.C., independent line. Go ahead, Robert.
Good morning, 16. I don't know where to begin. This gentleman here is unbelievable. I'm curious as to this gentleman's opinion as to what is the difference. There's two parts to my question, basically. What is the difference between the shooting in Aurora, those poor little children, Columbine, and all of these other incidents, which the news media is well aware of, and so much emphasis and focus on the Muslim aspect of it? We know that it's political. We know what that is. And Mr. Pratt, you have a lot of blood on your hands, sir. I would wonder very seriously, would you have a problem if they showed those poor little dead kids' bodies and all of those folks in that dark movie theater that you say there was some good guys in there, that nobody in there would have gotten killed except the killer? And I think you should be ashamed of yourself, sir. You really are. There's nothing American about you. You're almost a Nazi to me.
Let's get a response from Larry Pratt.
We know that the killer in Aurora went by a number of other theaters until he found the one that was posted, "No guns." And that's the one that he chose to commit his horrendous deed. What we have found, when you look at the data that we have, is that all of the mass murders in our country, save two, since 1950, have been perpetrated in gun-free zones. And these are places that by law prohibit people carrying guns, even if in other places in the state it might be legal. In Florida, people can carry a concealed firearm. But in Orlando, in that venue, in that club, law said it would be illegal to have a concealed carry firearm. And it appears that the perpetrator of this murder was very familiar with that club and knew that the patrons would be unarmed. And so we're never going to have an interview with him, but it would seem that he took advantage of a gun-free zone, knowing that he would be the only one doing the shooting for quite some time.
Daryl tweets in, can you speak to the fact that guns stream from lax gun law states into states with stricter laws?
Even if guns do emanate from states where the laws are more relaxed, the fact is that also in those states there's much less violent crime. So you have an anomaly that is not explained by the availability of guns. Chicago has extremely strict gun control laws, and until recently, as a result of a court decision, it had what amounted to a ban. and it has had and still has one of the worst murder rates in the country. Whereas even in jurisdictions in Illinois outside Chicago, let alone in nearby states, you have much lower violent crime rates and guns are readily available. So the argument that somehow guns are streaming into the areas that end up with all the worst violent crime doesn't really hold a lot of water. We're in the District of Columbia here at C-SPAN. Right across the river is Fairfax County, Virginia. Well over 1 million people. Very urban county, by the way, at least as urban as Washington, D.C. And the difference in the gun laws is stark. It's almost impossible to get a concealed carry permit in Washington, D.C. In Fairfax County, you can make your initial application over the mail. And lots of people have concealed carry firearms in Virginia, in Fairfax County, and yet the murder rate in Fairfax County on any given year is the same as or lower than England, which is often held up as the gold standard for how well gun control works. We have a murder rate in Fairfax County that in many countries of the world they would love to be able to hold up as their own.
Well, Jan Ness tweets in, is Larry packing right now? Carry a gun always? If not, why not?
We're in the District of Columbia, and in the District of Columbia, last I heard there are some 50 people that have a concealed carry permit. They've made it almost impossible. No surprise that the crime rate in the district is much higher than it is in Northern Virginia, where people like me can easily get a concealed carry permit and carry.
Next call is Richard in Gaithersburg, Maryland on our Democrats line. Gaithersburg is in the Washington suburbs.
Yes, good morning. I appreciate you taking my call. I have two questions and a comment that I'd like to make to your guest there, and I'll do them all at one time so that you can respond to them. The question one is, where do you stand on smart guns? And my next question is, what about requiring gun owners, just like car owners, to purchase insurance? That's my two questions. Now, my comment is this. Just as we as a society accept automobile accidents because people drive, and no matter how many accidents we have, people are going to continue to drive. Larry, isn't it true that you and people who support your position have made the decision that the price for you guys to have your guns is all these mass killings, and that no matter how many mass killings we have, as far as you guys are concerned, that's just the price that we as the society pay for your privilege to carry guns? Now, I'm not saying that you don't care about the people who got killed. I do believe that you care, and I'm not saying that you want this to happen. Just like nobody wants automobile accidents to happen, but many of us just accept that that's just the price for driving. And that's my comment.
Thank you, Richard. Larry Pratt.
Well, let's start with the latter point. If we're going to be arguing that people are willing to accept steep prices as the result of their position, I would like to ask, are you willing to accept the continued slaughter in gun-free zones as the price of imposing gun-free zones, knowing that for some 60 years, that's where virtually all of our mass murders have occurred? Or are you willing to work to get rid of gun-free zones so the dirtbags have a warning that it's not going to be shooting fish in a barrel anymore in such places? The technology for smart guns is a long way from being where anybody is willing to put their life in the hands of a gun that is so-called smart gun. Many police agencies have opposed it. They certainly don't want it for themselves. You're in a world of hurt if the battery goes out and the gun won't function. Then it becomes exceedingly dumb all of a sudden, and it could be at a very, very dangerous point. The smart gun also, if there are two police officers in an engagement and one finds it necessary to use the other's gun, he wouldn't be able to. with this kind of technology. So there are a lot of very steep obstacles that would have to be overcome before even police agencies, and certainly we could also add the general public, would be willing to accept something as dangerous, as risky, as smart guns. Insurance for gun owners, a lot of people have liability insurance already, and that's not really much of an issue even in legislatures where guns are not very popular. For one thing, if you impose a kind of insurance on a constitutional right, you're really heading into very dangerous territory that becomes in effect a tax, and you're taxing a right, and that's the power to destroy the exercise of that right. So we're not in favor of that. If somebody uses a gun and they harm someone else, even in a non-criminal fashion, they should be held liable. And we have laws on the books right now that will hold anybody liable for something like that. It's the same as if I have something around my house that leads to somebody being harmed. I can be sued and will be liable for damages. Same with firearms. So we don't need legislation there, which frankly at the hands of the likes of Senator Schumer of New York or the former Senator Kennedy, Massachusetts, would be simply a tool to go after the free exercise of the Second Amendment right that shall not be infringed. The idea that guns are the factor in the mass killings, I think maybe you came in late, but I've pointed already to the fact that we know that all of the mass killings in our country, save two, since 1950, have occurred in gun-free zones, where the law prohibited the average citizen from carrying a gun in that area. That's where dirtbags choose to commit their crimes. And I can certainly point to at least one case just 2-3 years ago in Oregon, in Clackamas, when a dirtbag was in a mall. It was posted, no guns. He had a gun anyway. He pulled his gun, killed somebody. Happily, a concealed carry holder, who was not supposed to have his gun, I'll say that, but he did outside the mall. He was perfectly legal, carrying his concealed carry firearm. He saw what the dirtbag was doing. He ran toward the dirtbag. When the dirtbag saw him coming, he committed suicide and ended what almost certainly would have been a mass murder.
Larry Pratt, where did your viewpoint on guns come from?
My viewpoint on guns came from my time getting interested in politics way back in the 60s, looking at the Constitution, looking at the history of our country, and realizing that as much as anything, the war for independence had been sparked by the British embargo on the importation of ammunition, powder and ball. The British kind of ignited the hostilities, although there had been skirmishes before Lexington and Concord. The Battle at Lexington, which is kind of viewed as the iconic beginning of the American War for Independence, began as a way of intercepting British troops on their way to Concord to confiscate the magazine of muskets, ball, and powder, so which the municipality was holding for the militia. The ammunition, not the muskets, I misspoke. So from a long study of our history, it's pretty clear that the British tyrants wanted to disarm us. And as we began to realize that we couldn't continue living under a government 3,000 miles away that didn't give a rip about their American cousins, it was guns that enabled us to defend ourselves. Had we been like the poor Chinese, that iconic figure standing up there against the tank, well, he got run over. And the Chinese government that did that to him is still in power. When the British tried that in 18th century America, we sent them packing.
Larry Pratt is the author of a book called Armed People Victorious, and he edited a book called Safeguarding Liberty, the Constitution, and Militias. His latest book, On the Firing Line, Essays in the Defense of Liberty, was published in 2001. Alan in Bear, Delaware, gun owner, thanks for holding. You're on with Larry Pratt.
Hi, and thank you for taking my call, and please be patient. I want to try to make a little bit of an analogy. I used to work on computers, fixing, upgrading them, and brand new out of the box, what you put into them is what you get back. And I look at our young children now, and the amount of increasing violence year by year that I've seen since the 1970s, even if parents don't want their kids to see these shows, there's advertisements, there's commercials for what's coming up that night, people pulling out guns. The increasing violence that Hollywood is putting into these young kids' heads is just amazing to me. And what you put into these kids' heads is what you're going to get back. And can we do anything about this? Because I think a lot of that, and your guest, I'm sure, realizes we used to have decency standards of things, and cable TV came along, and boy, everything's out the window. We are feeding our kids so much gun violence every day.
Now, Alan, you called in on the gun owners line. Would you support any further restrictions on your gun ownership?
I really don't think so, because I have a lot of fun shooting what I have. If our country gets to the point, and I made my point about the other things, why are we putting all these ideas into these young kids' heads? They grow up, and look what we have now.
Thank you, sir.
Alan, I would point out that we're within sight of the Capitol here in the C-SPAN studio, and I don't know for a fact what schools had ranges in them years ago, but I would wager that in one direction or another, probably less than a mile from here, there's still standing a building, may not be used as a school now, but that was used as a school sometime in the past, and in the basement they had ranges where students could go and shoot. Members had grown up in New York City, and he told me that he and his classmates once a week would have junior ROTC at the school, and he would get on the subway with his cased rifle and ride the subway to school, engage in target practice at the junior ROTC program, and then go back home with his rifle. So the rifle wasn't even kept lock and key at the school. And that's New York City. Obviously, I could tell you accounts that people have passed on from all over the country of that sort. Those, I think, were actually teaching moments. Kids, even if the kids weren't involved in shooting themselves, realized that guns were not something that were going to go off by themselves, and one had to run away from them as quickly as possible, but that their own classmates were trusted to handle them in a safe and intelligent fashion, and that's what was done. And we didn't have a problem with shootings in schools, even though on any given day of a week there might be lots and lots of guns and ammo in many, many schools. And still to this day there are schools in the hinterlands of our country where you could find that kind of activity going on. So I think we've actually given up what was a very powerful teaching tool, teaching not only responsible use of firearms, but teaching that firearms are no more alarming than automobiles. Actually, more people die because of the misuse of automobiles than firearms in our country. And that, I think, we're losing the opportunity to teach young people in schools because we've cut them off from any kind of contact with firearms, for the most part, in their schools. And I would very much like to see us turn back from where we are now and return to a time when we actually had a much better experience with children, young people, and firearms.
Raul, Waretown, New Jersey, Republican line. Go ahead, Raul.
Larry, it's been many, many years since I saw you.
Good to hear from you, sir.
way back, I think in the times of the Conservative Union it was, I think.
Could be.
I think your office was in the same building with you on the bench, right?
Yes, it was.
So,
Yeah.
Raul, what's your question or comment you'd like to make?
Well, I called because I've been watching carefully. I happen to be involved heavily, with undocumented aliens. I happen to be involved heavily with refugees over the years, and also I happen to be a clergyman. And naturally, these killings concern me too because of the innocent people's lives that suffer. And as you know, the Pope Francisco was one of the first ones to come out and condemn what happened down in Orlando. But I can't. I wonder about how you feel, like I feel, when I look at this and I see them. I say, well, what hypocrisy for some of these people who come out and wave and get on the bandstand and are talking about gun laws and everything else, when they don't even raise the voices with the amount of Hispanics over the past, especially over the past 2 years. I've been watching it carefully, from New York all the way to Florida, that are assaulted, that are attacked, that are robbed, jumped. Even their so-called leaders, they don't even raise an opinion at all about the suffering of the people.
Raul, we're going to leave it. We're going to let it stand there. Larry Pratt, any comment for that caller?
Let me just kind of take a slightly different tack from what Raul was saying. I think we can find a lot of hypocrisy in many of those who are leading the charge against firearms. We get one of my favorite moments in history in this regard was the mayor of Chicago at the time, many years ago, going before city council and arguing for what became the long-time gun control, almost total gun ban law in Chicago. And she argued that nobody needs a gun. Why would anybody want a gun? Well, there were 6 armed cops surrounding her as she made her presentation. And you just got to wonder, do they have any connection to the words they're saying? Do they pay attention to themselves? That was an extraordinary bit of hypocrisy, and she was not alone. She was not unique by any means.
Factual Panther tweets into you, Mr. Pratt. Well then, how about the right to own a howitzer?
Well, the founders didn't deal with it in the language of the Second Amendment, but at the time of the founding, in the Militia Act of 1791, they made it pretty clear what they had in mind for the Second Amendment. The Militia Act said that all men of military age were subject to call up by a militia. And in fact, at the time, the militia practices were fairly common, and the law stipulated that they had to bring their own rifle when they came, and if they didn't, they would be fined. The Militia Act also provided that if an individual were in an artillery company, which would be going to the howitzer question, they were not expected to bring artillery with them, but they still had to bring their rifle, kind of the Marine concept that every man a rifle. And so from the very beginning, there was this understanding in the law that kind of was the gloss of the Second Amendment, that the founders wanted the people to have military long arms equivalent to that which were in use by the military. Not artillery, not cannon, but certainly today it would be an M16 battle rifle.
Ron is in Bradenton, Florida. Go ahead, Ron.
I'm glad you just said that, sir. An M16 battle rifle. I'm an ex-Marine. I am a gun owner. Have been since I was 16 years old. I used the M16. And I can tell you from being in the fire team squad that an M16 is used as a single shot. Only one person in the squad would have it on automatic. for the simple fact that you'd use up too much ammunition in a firefight. So an M16, something that you just described, is just like an AR-15 that the gentleman used down here in Orlando.
It's kind of the tool for wealthy people.
Excuse me, sir. I'm not done. I love the Second Amendment, and you just talked about it. I love it completely. But it has to grow because it started out with a single-shot musket. And my last point is, I read in my newspaper this morning that since 1970, there has been more gun deaths in the United States than there has been since our great Revolutionary War that you just talked about also. Those things concern me.
Ron,
Can you take them
when you say the Second Amendment has to grow, how would you grow it?
I would grow it because the firearms have grown. A single shot means a single shot. I do not like a 30-round magazine. It is not sport. I grew up with my father hunting. One shot, one kill. That is what the founding father said. And he also said a militia. Now, our country has made it so we have a National Guard. That is our militia. And I can tell you that the gentleman that called in and said that they're going to take his land and he wants his gun to protect himself, that's not going to protect him from a Apache helicopter. This conspiracy theory is just out the window. You have to be realistic. If you're going to
Ron, we got your point. Let's hear from Larry Pratt.
I don't think that the Second Amendment has to grow. I think the founding generation were pretty clear that the Second Amendment, when they passed that Militia Act of 1791, was being fleshed out, and it was clear that a military rifle, the same rifle that any soldier would have, was what the militia was expected to have. And if they didn't have it, there were states for quite some time where one would be fined if you didn't come to militia muster and if you didn't come properly equipped with a rifle. The technology of the time can change, but the principle of the Second Amendment of an armed people does not change. And the reason we have the Second Amendment doesn't really get to hunting and target shooting. That's a collateral benefit, and one that, at least in target shooting, I enjoy. But the Second Amendment is designed as part of a package of amendments, the Bill of Rights, that were what the founders wanted to use to keep the government under control. And the Second Amendment has that purpose in mind, to keep us free people so that we enjoy the security of a free state, meaning a free society, that we don't have to worry about a police state emerging in America. And that, I think, is, in that sense, the Second Amendment has grown because technology has changed, but the principle has not. The National Guard that you mentioned came into existence in 1903. It does not amend the Second Amendment. It simply is federal legislation making that entity, the National Guard, an instrumentality of the federal government. And the federal government claims the ability to take over a state militia if they so choose, that's in the National Guard system. But that's not the militia, because the constitutional militia could not be controlled the way the National Guard could control a state militia, state guard.
Gene, Jackson, Mississippi, another gun owner. Hi, Gene.
Yes, sir. I've been a gun owner and a hunter since 1950, and here in Michigan, if you're waterfowl hunting, your gun can hold no more than 3 bullets. And the gun I have is a pump shotgun with a 5-round capacity, and I see no problem with me or any other gun owner that can get along fine with the 8 or 10 round magazine. And you, sir, mentioned dirt bags a few times. My definition of a dirt bag is someone to make a snide remark about Ted Kennedy's driver's license. And thank you very much, C-SPAN.
Larry Pratt, could you support limits on capacity?
The Second Amendment, I think, speaks very clearly to the concept of limiting the people's ability to be armed. As we were just discussing, it envisions a people that have the same kind of firepower that the government has in terms of every soldier. So if every soldier has an M16 with a 20-round magazine or whatever the military may be using, then that's certainly easily within the purview of the Second Amendment. And the idea that somehow we can hunt ducks with a 3 or a 5-round magazine, fine, I don't have any problem with that, because that's a sport, that's regulation. We're not really talking Second Amendment when we're talking about duck hunters. What we're talking about are the people being able to protect themselves in a constitutional system.
That caller mentioned, or you just mentioned, government guns and civilians. Tom Coburn, the former senator, has an op-ed this morning in the Wall Street Journal. Why does the IRS need guns? It details some of the departments that have bought assault weapons, bought guns, in case you're interested in reading it for yourself. Bill, Boyertown, Pennsylvania, you're the last call. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you for taking my call. I am a gun owner. I got my first gun when I was 12. Shot a deer with it. It was a single shot 12 gauge.
Didn't shoot your eye out.
Yeah, I think your guest today is doing an excellent job describing that the Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting, sport, target practice, personal protection, and he said it, but he didn't take it to the real extreme, which is that guns are to prevent the tyrannical government from ruling the citizenry in a tyrannical way, which means that at some point, if it gets to that point, we're to be armed, which means that if the IRS agents are armed, we are armed. That sets up what would be generally referred to as a confrontation. And the government doesn't like the fact that people point out that the Second Amendment is there as a check and balance in our republic, and as your guest mentioned, was required by the states as one of the 10 Bill of Rights in order for us to ratify this Constitution and create this federal government.
All right, Bill, thank you very much. Larry Pratt, last comment.
If you do a search on YouTube for Battle of Athens, you'll come up with the tail end of a movie. It had another name. I'm sorry, I don't remember that. But this was a 1947 situation that was described in the movie. Veterans returned to find that their town had been taken over by a very corrupt machine, political machine, and they kind of anticipated that the next election would be stolen. Well, indeed, the night of the election, the police illegally removed the ballots from the place of voting to the police station, and that violated state law. At that point, the militia, a bunch of men from the town and county, came swarming into town with rifles bristling from their cars and pickup trucks, surrounded the police station. There was a brief shootout that followed, and the cops finally realized, this is not going to end well, a lot more of them than of us. They left the ballot boxes, surrendered, left the police station, ballots were counted. Turned out the opposition, the reform slate, had won. That was the Second Amendment in action that night in Athens, Tennessee in 1947.
Larry Pratt is with the Gun Owners of America. The Senate on Monday will be conducting some gun legislation votes. Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
2 more segments coming up this morning.